Welcome to MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things magic. In today's video, we are going to unbox, reveal, discuss, and upgrade this Obscura Observation pre-constructed deck. What's up, MTG That is the MTG Burgeoning community. Welcome to this episode where today we are going to unbox and liberate the contents of this Obscura Operation Streets of New Capenna pre-constructed commander deck. So, there's no going back now. There's no going back. So let's see what we have inside. We've got our box. And we're going to keep pulling in. That's it for there. All right, so that's the packaging. Here we have our little counters, our divider. So that's pretty cool. All right. Inside the deck box itself, which, look at that. Damaged. Yikes. All right. Well, okay. I mean, it's not an extraordinarily sturdy box to begin with. So let's see what else we have in here. Empty. We'll seal our damaged deck box and put it right there. Some more packaging. There's our life wheel. This is our how to play. This is our deck. This is our collector booster sample pack, which will serve a greater purpose. So, though, right there are the contents of this deck. As usual, this pre-constructed deck comes with two different commanders. Let's begin talking about the front-facing commander, which is Capenna's Obscura Oculus. It's a 2/4 legendary cephalid rogue for 1 in Esper colors. And whenever we attack, target attacking creature can't be blocked this turn. And it connives, and connive is a new mechanic introduced to Streets of New Capenna, meaning that if a creature connives, we draw a card, and then we discard a card, and if we discard a non-land card, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. And then another attacking creature with lesser power gets double strike until end of turn. So with this commander, we're kind of challenging the historical archetype of what Esper is by shifting away from a control aspect and going more into a combat mode. At least that's what we're trying to do if we so choose to have Capenna as the general of this deck. General number 2 is Tivit, Seller of Secrets. Here we have a 6/6 legendary Sphinx Rogue for 3 in Esper colors. So the overall mana value on this commander is 2 more than Capenna's. So Tivit has Flying and Ward 3, and it also has the Council's Dilemma mechanic. So whenever Tivit enters the battlefield or deals combat damage to a player, starting with us, each player votes for evidence or bribery. For each evidence vote, we get to investigate, which means we will create a clue token. For each bribery vote, we will create a treasure token, and while voting, we may vote an additional time. So when we're looking at value, we're definitely looking here at Tivit and what it can do when it ETBs or is sent into combat. This commander seems to do more traditional things that one would expect when dealing with an Esper deck. For the purposes of this video moving forward, however, we are going to discuss this deck with the idea of choosing Capenna's as the primary commander. And now we're going to take a look at the cards that are unique to Streets of New Capenna, whether they're coming from the set or are brand new just for the purposes of being in the commander deck. We're going to start with 3 that come from the Streets of New Capenna set. And the first is an Offer You Can't Refuse. This is an instant that's going to counter target non-creature spell for 1 blue mana, and its controller creates 2 treasure tokens. So let's face it, if we're playing with Swansong, there's no reason we can't play with an Offer You Can't Refuse. Next, we have, of course, Obscura Charm in Esper colors. We're going to cast this at instant speed and choose one of the following 3 modes. We'll return target multicolored permanents with mana value 3 or less from our graveyard to the battlefield tapped. We'll counter target instant or sorcery spell, or we'll destroy target creature or planeswalker with mana value 3 or less. So the modes on this spell don't seem to be as strong as Esper Charm, but still they may be valuable depending on your meta. And lastly, we have Obscura Storefront. When this ETBs, we sacrifice it. We have to keep that in mind now. When it goes into play, we sacrifice it immediately. We don't get to pick when we do it. And when we do, we search our library for a basic plains, island, or swamp, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then we gain 1 life. I don't know if this is an upgrade over Evolving Wilds or Terramorphic Expanse, because 1 life in the format of Commander, I don't know if that's going to be necessarily that big of a deal. Maybe it's enough to swap out all of your Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanses for an Obscura Storefront, but that's your call to make. All right, next, these are the cards that are unique to the deck. You cannot get these in the set itself outside of their presence as in maybe one of the set packs or in any of the collector's packs. These are the cards unique to the Obscura Operation Commander deck, and we'll begin with Aerial Extortionist. It is a bird soldier 4/3 flying for 3 and 2 white mana. When it ETBs or deals combat damage to a player, we exile up to 1 target non-land permanent, and for as long as that card remains exiled, its owner may cast it. Whenever another player casts a spell from anywhere other than their hand, we get to draw a card. So just having this on the battlefield will allow us to draw a card whenever anyone casts their commander. That's something to keep in note when we're always talking about the deficiencies of White's card draw. I do wish that this card had flash. I think it would be much stronger if it did, because then that way we could save one of our permanents from getting spot removed. Next up, we have Jailbreak. This is a sorcery for 1 and a white. We get to return target permanent in an opponent's graveyard to the battlefield under their control. And when that permanent ETBs, we return up to 1 target permanent card with equal or lesser mana value from our graveyard to the battlefield. Now, this is something that Esper definitely would never want to do. And for me, personally, it is not a card that I would play with, because I would never want to put any permanents of any opponents from any graveyard onto the battlefield under their control. Regardless of how it works out for me, I do not want to help out my opponents. Next up, and one of the most valuable cards of the pre-constructed decks, we have Smuggler's Share, an enchantment for 2 and a white. At the beginning of each end step, keep that in mind, at the beginning of each end step, draw a card for each opponent who drew 2 or more cards this turn, and then create a treasure token for each opponent who had 2 or more lands enter the battlefield under their control this turn. This enchantment is very powerful. It can help with card draw, it can help with ramp. This is one of the cards I would want in my opening hand, or a card I draw in the first couple turns of the game. This is not a card I want to draw late, because I sense it would be a dead card in the hand. So Smuggler's Share has its benefits, but it can also have its detriments as well. Next card up is Cephalid Face Taker. It's a 1/4 Cephalid Rogue for 2 and a blue. It can't be blocked, and at the beginning of combat on our turn, we may have this become a copy of another target creature until end of turn, except it's 1/4 and has this creature can't be blocked. Okay, so keep that in mind. Perhaps there's the potential to utilize Infect with that. However, for the purposes of this deck, we are looking to sneak in with that combat damage for the Connive mechanic. Next, we have Change of Plans. This is an instant for X white and a blue. Each of X target creatures we control connive, and then we may have any number of those creatures phase out. So this can help us with card looting. This could help us with power and toughness boosts. This could help us with protecting our creatures. And let's be honest, it could help with a lot of combat shenanigans as well. I like this card a lot. I think this card will be extraordinarily powerful in a Hinata Dawncrowned deck. Next, we have In Too Deep. It is an enchantment. It is an aura for 2 blue with the split-second mechanic. So as long as this spell is on the stack, players can't cast spells or activate abilities that aren't mana abilities. So for the purposes of this discussion, split-second really is kind of like this spell cannot be countered. We get to enchant a creature, a planeswalker, or a clue with In Too Deep, and when we do, the enchanted permanent becomes a colorless clue artifact that we can tap to, sacrifice to draw a card, and it loses all of its abilities. So this is a pretty good way for blue to deal with creatures and planeswalkers by keeping them on the battlefield in the form of a clue. Next up, we have an equipment called Mask of the Schemer. It's 2 and a blue with an equip cost of 2, and whenever an equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, it connives X, where X is the amount of damage it dealt to that player. So if we're swinging in with a creature and it deals 4 damage, we're going to draw 4 cards, we're going to discard 4 cards, and each time we discard a non-land card that way, we're going to put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. Mask of the Schemer in this deck, with the kind of archetype that we're building through the connive and unblockable mechanic, that could be an extremely valuable source of card filter, or of card looting, buffing, and inflicting some combat damage. Next, we have Skyway Robber. It's a 3/3 bird rogue for 3 and a blue. It has flying, and it also has the escape mechanic. We're going to escape this from the graveyard for 3 and a blue and exiling 5 other cards from our graveyard. When it escapes with whenever Skyway Robber deals combat damage to a player, we may cast an artifact, instant, or sorcery spell from among cards exiled with Skyway Robber without paying its mana cost. So as long as we have enough cards in our graveyard, and they are at least some valuable or a valuable instant or sorcery spell, we escape Skyway Robber, get it out of our graveyard, back onto the battlefield, and we gain the benefit of casting a sorcery or instant spell for free. All right, next card up, we have Lethal Scheme. It's a black instant for 2 and 2 black with the Convoke mechanic. This means that our creature can help us cast this spell, and each creature we tap while casting this spell pays for 1 colorless mana or 1 mana of that creature's color. So if we have 2 black creatures in play, we can tap both of them to pay for the 2 black mana of this spell. And what the spell does is it destroys target creature or planeswalker, and each creature that convoked Lethal Scheme connives. So if we are fortunate enough to tap 4 creatures to cast this spell technically for free, we're going to loot 4 times. We're going to potentially put upwards to 4 +1/+1 counters on our on 4 total +1/+1 counters on our creatures. Plus, we get the benefit of removing a creature or a planeswalker from the battlefield. Next card up is Misfortune Teller. This is a 3/1 human warlock with Death Touch for 3 and a black. When it ETBs or deals combat damage to a player, we get to exile a card from a graveyard. If a creature card is exiled this way, we create a 2/2 black rogue creature token. If it's a land card, we create a treasure token. If it's a non-creature, non-land card, we gain 3 life. For the purposes of this deck, this is a great way to make sure that our opponents are staying away from engaging in any kind of combat shenanigans, as long as we can swing in for that damage, which, with Camise and the unblockable trigger that's going to be given to potentially Misfortune Teller, we'll have a great way to sneak in and do that damage and reap the benefits of exiling cards from our opponent's graveyards, and reap the benefit of either creating a treasure token, gaining some life, or creating a 2/2 black rogue. Next up, we have Writ of Return, a sorcery for 3 and 2 black. This has the Cipher mechanic. So whenever we cast this spell, we may exile it, encode it on a creature we control, and then whenever that creature deals combat damage to a player, we may cast a copy of this spell without paying its mana cost. And what this spell will do is it will return target creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield tapped. As we are conniving, we are most likely going to be discarding some creatures and getting them into the graveyard. Writ of Return is a great way to get that creature back from the graveyard onto the battlefield, and if we can cipher it onto one of our conniving creatures with Camise's attack trigger, we can continue to deal that combat damage because that creature will be unblockable. Next, we have Life Insurance. It's an enchantment for 3 in white and a black. And whenever a non-token creature dies, we lose 1 life and we create a treasure token. This also has the Extort mechanic. So whenever we cast a spell, we may pay a white or a black mana. And if we do, each opponent loses 1 life and we gain that much life. This card could be one of those cards that backfires because it's not a May ability for losing the 1 life. And whenever a non-token creature dies, we're going to be forced to lose that life. And yes, we do get the benefit of creating a treasure token. So use this card at your own risk. This card, I think, would be a fantastic addition to an Athreos Shadowborn Apostle deck. Next, we have Obscura Confluence. It's an instant, 1, a white, a blue, and a black. And we get to choose 3, and we can choose the same mode more than once. And these 3 modes are: until end of turn, target creature loses all abilities and has base power toughness 1/1. Target creature connives, or target player returns a creature card from their graveyard to their hand. For the purposes of this deck, those are 3 pretty valuable modes to have, particularly because we are attacking, so it would not be a bad idea to have some of our opponents that are blocking our creatures have their creatures become 1/1 with no abilities until end of turn. Plus with the connive, and then plus with returning creature cards from our graveyard to our hand, Obscura Confluence fits what we want to do in this deck very, very well. All right, 2 new cards left, and we have Oscar, Rubbish Reclaimer, a 3/3 legendary human wizard for 3 blue and a black. This spell will cost 1 colorless mana less to cast for each different mana value among cards in our graveyards. So at best, this will cost us a blue and a black. And whenever we discard a non-land card, we may cast it from our graveyard. So if we have Oscar in play and we connive and we discard a non-land card, because of the connive mechanic, that creature gets a +1/+1 counter, but then Oscar will allow us to cast that card from our graveyard. So if we can get that engine of value revving, it shouldn't be long until we close out a game and become victorious over our opponents. And the last new card for the Obscura Operation, that will be Currency Converter. It's Obscura Operation and not Observation. This is an artifact for 1, and whenever we discard a card, we may exile that card from our graveyard. We can pay 2 mana, tap this to draw a card and discard, so we can have a looting effect. We can tap this to put a card exiled with Currency Converter into our graveyard. If it's a land, we create a treasure. If it's a non-land card, we create a 2/2 black creature token. So this is a way in which to kind of juggle around the cards that we are discarding from the connive mechanic, and it allows us to do different things with them. And even if we can't, Currency Converter has a built-in pseudo connive ability that will allow us to loot by discarding a card after we draw a card. The following group of cards are the reprints that are included in the Obscura Operation deck, and we're not going to spend too much time going over these cards because they are not new to the format, and let's face it, the majority of these cards could be very interchangeable when thinking about updating, upgrading, or enhancing the overall theme and scope of this deck. So let's get right to it. We're going to start with Archon of Coronation. This is going to introduce the Monarch to the game. Okay, that will work out well for us. And there's some removal with Austere Command. These are all in the pre-constructed deck. We have Dusk to Dawn. And there's the good old Sun Titan for all of our recursion dreams. Champion of Wits will help with the Eternalize mechanic after discarding this to a connive trigger. Chasm Skulker for drawing all those cards. We can make so many squid creature tokens. Commit to Memory is also going to be included here. We have Ghostly Pilferer. Again, this is going to help us with all of the draw cards and discard card shenanigans. Identity Thief is going to come down, and that's going to help us to create some, let's say, battlefield shenanigans. Similar to Chasm Skulker, but on a different level, we have Nadir Kraken. This is going to allow us that whenever we draw a card to pay 1, and if we do, we can put a counter on this and create a blue tentacle creature token. Stolen Identity, again, helps out the deck with the Cipher mechanic so that we can really take advantage of those unblockable creatures. Custody Lich, another card that introduces a Monarch to the game. Drana, Liberator of Malakir, is one of those creatures that's really going to help buff up our creatures. If we send Drana into play, it has the evasion, which is fantastic. It has the first strike, which can protect itself in combat. And those unblockable creatures will continue to get bigger and bigger by getting +1/+1 counters put onto them by Drana. We got the Graveblade Marauder, another Death Toucher in the deck that's just going to help us make some difficult choices for our opponents in combat. We have Nightmare Unmaking. Okay, this is going to be a sorcery for 5. And again, it's going to help us to either clear out some bigger creatures or some smaller creatures. All right, Profane Command, been around for a long time. You get to pick two of those four modes. And look at this, for the first time ever, we get to have an Alila Artful Provocateur reprint. I am most excited to have this reprint. I wouldn't mind having Alila helm a deck of her very own. She's just great. She was originally printed in one of the Throne of Eldraine Brawl decks, and here she is in her first reprint in this deck, and that makes me very, very happy. Daxis is another creature that's going to help with the overall combat theme of this deck. And look at this reprint here, Dragon Lord Ojutai, a massive reprint of value in this Esper deck. So strong at what it does. Very, very good reprint in that deck. Another sneaky reprint here is Fallen Shinobi. This card was really starting to escalate in price because of all of the ninja synergies that came about with Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. And I suspect that if it wasn't going to be reprinted in this deck, we were going to see that bad boy go higher and higher, and who knows when it would have been reprinted after that. Shadow Mage Infiltrator has the Fear mechanic, and it's going to make it difficult to block, and it's going to help out with the draw card and discard card. I'm sorry, that doesn't make us discard a card. That lets us draw a card if it deals combat damage. Here's another one of those creatures that we're getting really, really high in value. So glad to see Silent Blade Oni reprinted in this deck. Thief of Sanity. All right, so that's going to help us with the draw card. Here's some removal and Utter End. Rexio Risen Deep, if we can send this into unblockable combat. Boy, oh boy, the payoff there by being able to cast an instant or sorcery spell from that player's graveyard without paying for it. Rexio, we can consider that to be a potential win condition in this deck. Quietus Spike, imagine slapping this onto one of those unblockable creatures from Kamisa's Trigger, and then it deals combat damage to a player, and that player loses half their life. Yeah, that could happen. Look at that reprint. Did you ever think you'd see a Strionic Resonator with brand new art printed in a pre-constructed commander deck? Never thought I would see that. And there's a Wayfarer's Bauble. That's the first time this has been reprinted in some time. And there's the customary gotta have that Swords to Plowshare reprint. Daring Saboteur, another creature that can be unblockable. There's the Looter Ilkor with the Shadow mechanic. That's going all the way back to the days of Tempest. And that, my friends, is 1997. A creature with Shadow can only be blocked by other creatures with Shadow. So this is just going to help strengthen the theme of sending those unblockable creatures into combat. Treasure Cruise for the draw. Whirler Rogue is in there to create some more potential evasive creatures. Ink Fathom Witch will allow each of our unblocked creatures to have base power toughness 4/1, and that's going to bring some lot of life totals down to 0 a lot more quickly. Mask of Riddles is going to give a equipped creature fear, and if it deals combat damage, we're going to draw a card. Of course, fear is the creature can only be blocked by black and or artifact creatures. There's our reprint of Arcane Signets. There's the Azorius Signet, fantastic. Our Commander Sphere. Our Demir Signet, and we got our Felwar Stone, and this one needed a reprint. It has been reprinted so many times, yet the value always rebounds. And we have our Orzhov Signet, and there is our Soul Ring, and lastly we have our Swiftfoot Boots, and those are the reprints in this Obscura Operation deck. And here is a breakdown of the land base that's been included in this Obscura Operation deck. We're starting off with 4 basic plains, 5 basic islands, and 5 basic swamps. In addition to those basic lands, we're also getting, for the first time ever, look at that, we're getting some of the alternate showcase art for our basics. So that's going to be 1 plains to bring the total up to 5, 1 island to bring that total up to 6, and then 1 swamp to bring the total of swamps up to 6. So this is a 3-color deck, so we do have to pay attention to the color fixing of this deck. Included, we have 3 lands that are going to give us white-blue mana. One of them is a filter land, so we need to generate some mana in order to use it. The other is one of the battle lands, which is going to come into play tapped unless we control 2 or more basic lands. And the last one is Port Town, which will come into play tapped unless we reveal a plains or island card from our hand. And similar to what we have for the Azorius colors, we have our Dimir colors here. And again, we have a battle land for blue-black. And we have the Choked Estuary, which is like Port Town, which is going to make us reveal a land, reveal an island or swamp where it's going to be tapped. And we have our own filter land in the Darkwater Catacombs. Now, for the purposes of this deck's mana base, there's only 1 card that was included that was going to act as an Orzhov balanced card. And surprise, surprise, for the first time in the history of these pre-constructed decks, we're going to get some filter lands. They included the Fetid Heath. What a fantastic card. What a fantastic land cycle to include in these commander decks. So this is right now our white-black or white-white-black-black land that's going to be used to help us fix our mana. So these options are decent to keep. The Port Town and the Choked Estuary, those seem like they may come into play tapped more often than not. Additionally, coming into play tapped are these following lands. They did include 3 of the Thriving lands from the Jumpstart boxes, or from the Jumpstart product. So these are going to come into play tapped, and when each one does come into play, we pick a color other than the color it provides, and then this card will give 1 color of any mana that you picked in addition to the one included. For all the hoops that you have to jump through, and for the purposes of trying to get as few lands that ETB tapped as possible, one of the first changes I would make is I would take these 3 lands out and I would just put in the respective check lands. They come into play tapped unless, you have an island or a plains or a swamp, and the land can check itself and make sure it comes into play untapped. But those would be some of the first lands that I would replace. Arcane Sanctum is going to come into play tapped, but it's going to give us 1 of any of the colors we need. And honestly, I would just replace this card with the appropriate Triumph from Streets of New Capenna. I know they're not called Triumphs, but I'm not ready to call them Tricycle lands either. They are including a Temple of Silence. I would replace this with some other white-black land, or with some other land that can provide white-black colors, or 1 of each. Perhaps a Reflecting Pool, or maybe go as far as just including a Tainted Peak. This is being included, Creeping Tar Pit. This comes into play tapped, gives us a blue or a black, and then can become a creature. Again, in trying to minimize the lands that come into play tapped, I would find one that could come into play and not be that. This last card comes into play tapped, but it's a bit of a tricky one, because Path of Ancestry, it will give us 1 of any of the colors we need, and it is going to be very unlikely that we're going to be able to benefit from the Scry trigger very much, just because this is not really a tribal deck. So for the purposes of balancing here, Path of Ancestry in a lot of ways is no different than just a tapped tri-land. So if there's some other land, maybe like a Mana Confluence, that could take this card's spot, these are some of the lands that I would upgrade right off the bat. And of course, we have our Command Tower and our Exotic Orchard. Those 2 seem to be, well, especially the Command Zone. That and the Exotic Orchard are pretty much auto-includes in these decks. And lastly, we have what we can consider, I guess, a form of fetch land in this deck. We have an Esper Panorama. which is going to, it's actually going to give us some mana, unlike what an Exotic Orchard or a Terramorphic Expanse would do. So we can get the colorless mana for it, but we are still just cracking it for a basic land that comes into play tapped, which is similar to what Myriad Landscape does, but this comes into play tapped, and it starts off a little bit more slowly than the Esper Panorama. However, we get the benefit by tapping for 2 and sacrificing that for 2 basic land cards. However, both of them have to share a type, and in a deck that has 3 colors, it may be better off to replace this with, if you can, just a regular fetch land. And lastly, we have the Ash Barrens, which will give us a colorless mana, but it also has basic land cycling that we can pay 1 and discard that card to search our library for a basic land and put it into our hand. And the last land included is one that's going to help us synergize the theme of this deck, and that's Rogue Passage. We're going to let one of our creatures become unblockable, and all it's going to cost us is an investment of 4 mana and turning this land sideways. And the last items included in this Obscura Operation deck, we have our thicker Showcase Foil General, I guess we could call this like a proxy, because it's awfully thick. You're not going to put this into our hand, of Camise Obscura Oculus. We've got one of those. These are the tokens that were included. We have our Tentacles, some Fairies, Squids for the Chasm Skulker, Thopters, and on the reverse side we have some treasure tokens, of course, the Monarch, some Rogues, and 2 Clues, and a Champion of Wits. And lastly, they set some +1/+1 counter punch-out counters, and the Obscura Operation Insignia. And last and probably least, a rules card talking about the popular Magic formats and how to play the game.
Obscura Operation is a combat-driven Esper build featuring the new Connive mechanic. When a creature connives, its controller draws a card and then discards a card. If that player discarded a non-land card, then put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. With this dynamic in mind, the following cards are some possible upgrades to the original deck list, each of which enhances the established theme of this build. Nashi, Moon Sage's Scion, has the ninjutsu mechanic, which can be activated targeting the unblockable creature from Camise's attack trigger, resulting in the exiling of numerous cards from which we may play 1 until the end of turn by paying life equal to its mana value rather than paying its mana cost. Ninja of the Deep Hours also has ninjutsu and draws us a card whenever it deals combat damage to an opponent. When targeted by Camise's attack trigger, we will end up drawing 2 cards and discarding 1. Sending unblockable creatures into combat is a great reason to include Reconnaissance Mission, as each time one of our creatures deals combat damage to an opponent, we will draw a card. If additional card draw is a theme of this deck, then including Teferi's Ageless Insight will double the number of cards drawn from our Connive triggers. Since Connive forces us to discard a card, let's benefit from this action by using Drake Haven in order to create a Flying Drake creature token each time we discard a card. As Camise's trigger makes one of our attacking creatures unblockable each turn, let's attach Lion Sash to one of them for the purposes of delivering even more impactful combat damage, while also exiling permanents from graveyards. As Connive can add a +1/+1 counter to a creature, perhaps including a copy of Cathar's Crusade will enhance this +1/+1 counter theme and make our combats even more impactful. Remember, Camise makes one creature unblockable and gives another creature double strike. Boosting the power and toughness of our creatures in this way will send our opponent's life totals to 0 much more quickly. Due to Camise's unblockable trigger, we can expect to get through for some combat damage. A great payoff for this dynamic is Necropolis Regent. Each time one of our creatures deals combat damage to a player, we will put those many +1/+1 counters on it. Considering that we must discard a non-land card in order to get a +1/+1 counter onto a creature with Connive, our graveyard could be filled with creatures, and since combat is our path to victory, it's reasonable to think that many creatures across the battlefield will fall during combat. So let's bring them all back and under our control by casting Rise of the Dark Realms. This potential game-ending spell could completely tilt the match in our favor. Speaking of potentially game-ending spells, Akroma's Will should close out the game by enabling our creatures with a litany of powerful keyword abilities. The Obscura Operation Precon deck creates a new combat-driven avenue to victory in Esper colors, one that has not been seen since Commander 2018's introduction of Verena Lich Queen. With some valuable reprints, a new mechanic, and an array of freshly minted cards, I think the design of this deck has a lot to offer players who want to engage in combat shenanigans in colors traditionally reserved for control archetypes.